Today in the Daily Dose, American Imperialism. Defined as the expansion of political, economic, cultural, and military influence beyond the borders of the United States. Over the years, American imperialism has taken the form of outright military conquest, military protectionist policies, unequal treaties, gunboat diplomacy, forced regime change, as well as economic and diplomatic support of foreign entities. From the time the first settlers arrived in Virginia from England and started moving westward, writes Yale historian Paul Kennedy, this was an imperial nation, a conquering nation, while George Washington described the young nation as an infant empire. Hence the prince that acquires new territory, if he finds it vacant, wrote Benjamin Franklin, or removes the natives to give his own people room, may be properly called fathers of their nation, while Thomas Jefferson proclaimed in 1786 that the United States must be viewed as the nest from which all Americans, North and South, is to be peopled. During the first half of the 19th century, the United States population witnessed a near five-fold expansion due to high birth rates and a rising tide of immigration from Europe. Combined with the economic depressions of 1819 and 1839, westward migration exploded as Americans searched for new land and opportunities. The term manifest destiny first appeared in an editorial published in the Democratic Review in the summer of 1845, when a writer made criticism of the lingering opposition to the annexation of Texas from Mexico, urging readers toward a national unity for the fulfillment of our manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions. That same summer, an article by John O'Sullivan in the New York Morning News referenced manifest destiny in light of the Oregon Territory, which was another vast swatch of land which American politicians and laymen alike were eager to assert control over. While the conquering spirit of manifest destiny witnessed a near stunning territorial expansion over the first half of the 19th century, the unrelenting westward spread of Americans not only led to war with Mexico, but also witnessed the wanton mistreatment and dislocation of Hispanics, Native Americans, and other non-Europeans living in the path of westward settlers, at the same time fueling a contentious two-sided debate over which new territories and states would embrace the brutal institution of slavery, eventually leading a divided nation headlong into civil war. In 1801, after Spain secretly returned the Louisiana Territory to France, Americans grew ever more fearful that Napoleon Bonaparte had plans to tighten his hold on New Orleans and vital shipping routes along the Mississippi, prompting President Thomas Jefferson to write in a letter to Robert Livingston, the U.S. Minister to France, that the day France takes possession of New Orleans, we must marry ourselves to the British fleet and nation. A year later, after Spain revoked a U.S.-Spanish treaty granting Americans the right to store goods in New Orleans, Jefferson sent future U.S. President James Monroe to Paris, where Livingston had previously been tasked with negotiating the purchase of New Orleans for an estimated ceiling price of $10 million. Instead, due to France's weakened economy and Napoleon's impending war with Great Britain, even before Monroe's ship arrived into France, in April of 1803, Livingston was taken by surprise when French officials asked him if the U.S. might be interested in purchasing the entirety of the Louisiana Territory, some 828,000 square miles of pristine land, thereby doubling the size of the young republic. Upon Monroe's arrival, negotiations came to a rapid conclusion when in late April, the team of U.S. emissaries agreed to pay $15 million for what would later become all or part of 15 American states. Dated April 30th and signed on May the 2nd, the U.S. Senate ratified the purchase in October of 1803, which was officially transferred by France the following month. Purchased for less than 3 cents an acre, the Louisiana Purchase proved to be one of Jefferson's most notable achievements while in office, which in turn unleashed a near immediate flood of westward explorers onto lands once the sole domain of Native American peoples. Beginning in pre-colonial times, conflicts between westward expanding white Europeans and displaced Native Americans led to some 315 years of what has collectively become known as the Indian Wars. With each successive push into Western lands, wars with Native Americans became ever more deadly, including the Northwest Indian War in the Great Lakes region, resulting in subsequent treaties like the Treaty of Greenville and the Treaty of Fort Wayne. After Congress signed the Indian Removal Act of 1830, some 60,000 Native Americans were deported from their native lands during the Trail of Tears, leading to the ethnic cleansing deaths of up to 16,700 people. By the dawn of the 1820s, many Latin American countries had won independence from Spain and Portugal, yet Britain and the United States worried that European powers would yet again try to colonize the Western Hemisphere. While President James Monroe at first favored a joint U.S.-British resolution against future colonization, Secretary of State John Quincy Adams distrusted Britain's own colonial intentions, convincing Monroe to make a unilateral statement of U.S. policy, which he delivered to Congress on December 2, 1823. At the time of Monroe's bold message that the Western Hemisphere was off limits to European interference, the young nation lacked enough military clout at the time, which made Monroe's assertion somewhat pointless until the United States became a dominating world power. Not until the Civil War ended would the Monroe Doctrine come of age, when the U.S. government sent military and diplomatic aid to Benito Juárez in Mexico, which allowed his forces to overthrow French-supported Emperor Maximilian from the throne. Theodore Roosevelt was next to invoke the Monroe Doctrine when he used it to justify a succession of U.S. interventions in Latin America. Known as the Roosevelt Corollary, or his Big Stick policy, after Roosevelt took office in September of 1901, he intervened militarily in Central America and the Caribbean, including Nicaragua, Haiti, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic. FDR later softened Roosevelt's Big Stick policy with his Good Neighbor policy, which ushered in a period of greater cooperation between North and South American countries. But at the same time, FDR invoked the Monroe Doctrine repeatedly to intervene over affairs in a number of South and Central American countries. During the Cold War, President John F. Kennedy invoked the Monroe Doctrine during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, followed by President Ronald Reagan, who invoked the Monroe Doctrine for U.S. interventions in El Salvador and Nicaragua. President George H.W. Bush was the last president to invoke the Monroe Doctrine when he sanctioned a U.S.-led invasion of Panama in an effort to oust corrupt Panamanian dictator Manuel Noriega. In the 1840s, America was still a fairly young country, and its people and politicians were hungry for westward expansion. President James K. Polk was especially eager to acquire more territory. His belief in manifest destiny, the idea that the United States had an inherent obligation to expand westward across the North American continent, further incentivized American pioneers to migrate west. Pioneer motivations were many, including spreading religious dogma, to striking it rich in business, or simply setting out for a fresh start. The rush for westward expansion didn't sit well with Mexico, who was already bitter about losing Texas to the U.S. after Texas won its independence from Mexico in 1836. President Polk wanted California and New Mexico as well, and after he offered $30 million to Mexico for a possible land transfer, Mexico refused to sell. In light of his belief in manifest destiny, Polk refused to take no for an answer, sending in troops to occupy a disputed area of the Texas-Mexico border. When American and Mexican troops clashed over the issue, Polk seized the moment to declare war on Mexico on May 13, 1846. While the two-year conflict would see 21 major battles, Kit Carson participated in the conquest of California from Mexico, rising yet again to national acclaim when he walked 15 miles barefoot to fetch reinforcements from San Diego after the disastrous Battle of San Pascual. Ultimately, Mexico proved ill-prepared for war due to messy internal politics and a woefully undertrained army. After 2 years of fighting, Mexico was defeated, and in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Mexico ceded a third of her territory to the U.S. Ceded lands included modern-day Utah, California, Nevada, Arizona, and Texas, making the land transfer the largest single territorial expansion in the history of the United States. The war further helped to solidify the reputations of many U.S. generals, including future President Zachary Taylor, as well as Civil War titans Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant. Now that the United States had reached the Pacific Ocean, settlement of California soon led to an event known as the California Genocide. And while the indigenous death estimates vary widely from 2,000 to 100,000 lives, after gold was discovered in California, the influx of 49ers formed militias to kill and displace indigenous people, while the government of California supported white settlements through the passage of the Act for the Government and Protection of Indians, which legalized the enslavement of Native Americans for use much like the Southern-style enslavement of African Americans. California legislators also offered and paid bounties for the killing of Native Americans, making the California Genocide a period of disgraceful and immoral treatment of indigenous peoples. Under the banner of Manifest Destiny and a nascent sense of white supremacy, between the Mexican-American and Civil Wars, ambitious Americans attempted repeated land grabs in Central and South America, earning the name of filibusters or filibustero in the Spanish. Among the most successful or unsuccessful, dependent upon his ultimate fate, was lawyer and newspaperman William Walker, who moved from New Orleans to Northern California, where he recruited a small band of largely failed gold miners for a planned takeover of Baja, Mexico. Sailing out of San Francisco Bay with a ragtag crew of 45 men, Walker arrived in Cabo San Lucas at the end of October 1853, capturing La Paz by early November. His ranks swelled to over 300 enthusiastic mercenaries, until his lack of leadership and his beleaguered supply chain forced his retreat towards San Diego, where he surrendered to a detachment from the U.S. Army. Acquitted by a San Francisco jury in just 8 minutes' time, a testament to the strength of public opinion in Walker's favor, a year later, Walker took advantage of the Civil War in Nicaragua, capturing the city of Granada before declaring himself president of the country in October of 1855. After Walker revoked shipping magnate Cornelius Vanderbilt's right to transit Nicaragua, Vanderbilt raised a private army that was soon joined by anxious forces from Costa Rica, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, forcing Walker from power in less than 10 months' time, only to receive a hero's welcome upon his return to the States. In 1860, Walker launched yet another filibustering or freebooting campaign, as it was commonly known, this time in Honduras, quickly drawing the ire of the British government, which still had strategically important colonies in Central America. The Royal British Navy captured Walker upon his arrival in Trujillo, turning him over to Honduran authorities, who executed him by firing squad in September of that same year, at just 36 years of age. 8 months later, upon the outbreak of the American Civil War, filibustering faded into obscurity, while the uniquely American belief in manifest destiny fizzled out by 1867. making filibustering in Central America one of the oddest overreaches in American history. Following the end of the Mexican-American War in February of 1848, Mexico's defeat handed much of the west coast of North America to the United States, prompting slaveholding factions within the antebellum South to dream of spreading slavery across the continent and beyond. A year later, after the discovery of gold in California, slaveholding Southerners began moving to the territory in large numbers, bringing with them an estimated 500 to 1,500 African American slaves to work the gold fields of the High Sierras and beyond, prompting pro-slavery expansionists like Henry Weiss to wager that his home state of Virginia would make $1 billion on the sale of slaves into the territory, which was hastily made a free state on September 9, 1850. Weiss's prediction proved patently wrong when Southern slaveholders discovered a second form of slavery in the American West, including Native American captives and indebted mestizo peasants, which enslaved thousands into multiple forms of bondage or peonage in the newly acquired territories of Utah, Arizona, California, and New Mexico, employing systems of forced labor far less costly than plantation agriculture and chattel slavery. Still holding immense political sway in Washington during the years leading up to secession and war, every time Whig or Republican abolitionists attempted to outlaw peonage in the American West, Southern legislators pushed back against every attempt in the 1850s, knowing full well that any law against peonage out west would eventually point a finger at their own form of slavery in the South. Despite growing abolitionist sentiment within the northern states, Southerners held fast to their expansionist visions for the American West, supported in large part by the formidable spread of Euro-American imperialism abroad, which relied heavily on indigenous coercive labor, from the British in India to the Dutch and French in Southeast Asia, prompting slaveholding Southerners to question why slavery couldn't be a part of white imperialism. With the hope of expanding their cotton markets into China, Southern legislators argued in Congress to a southern route for the Transcontinental Railroad, pointing to a terminus in port cities in Southern California to build up their Pacific trade. Yet when Abraham Lincoln took office on March 4, 1861, Southern dreams for slavery in America collapsed in the face of untenable bloodshed during the American Civil War. After the Suez Canal opened in 1869, the shortcut around Africa set off a wave of colonial expansionism that exploded around the world until its abrupt end in 1914, after the start of World War I. Spurred on by European nations and the United States seeking raw materials and fresh export markets for their Industrial Revolution-era products, breakthroughs in medicine, communication, and transportation inspired strong nation-states to exert control over much of Africa, Asia, and Polynesia. Now known as New Imperialism, famed British poet Rudyard Kipling penned a satirical 7-stanza poem entitled The White Man's Burden, in response to America's annexation of the Philippines and Guam, following their victory over Spain during the 3-month Spanish-American War of 1898, which in turn led to the Philippine-American War of 1899, when Filipinos resisted the forced takeover of their sovereign nation. As an imperialist poet, Kipling's poem encouraged Americans to take up the noble cause of empire building, at the same time warning readers about the high costs in money and lives incurred in the process of building empires abroad. American imperialist leaders, in turn, used the jingoistic phrase "white man's burden" as justification for foreign colonization, cobbling the term into a mission statement of sorts, intended to raise up the uncivilized black or brown peoples of the world, which made for a natural extension of the early 19th century philosophy of manifest destiny. During the New Imperialism era, Predominantly white nation-states believed they were morally obliged to civilize the non-white peoples of the earth, encouraging economic, social, and cultural advances through colonization of people they felt were incapable of self-governance. While new imperialism in truth led to improvements in infrastructure, living standards, and overall development of third-world countries, the period also witnessed a high volume of atrocities committed by European and American overlords that in many ways negated the moral justifications of imperialism, including brutal acts in the Belgian Congo, where an estimated 8 million natives died between 1885 and 1908, while neighboring French Congo introduced brutal labor practices and the introduction of foreign diseases that wiped out 50% of the indigenous population, making new imperialism in the white man's burden a period of nationalistic land grabs by white racists everywhere. After its loss to Great Britain during the Crimean War of 1853 to 1856, Russian officials feared losing their remote and weakly defended Alaska territory to further British aggression, at the same time fearing their loss of the territory to the same brand of American expansionism that saw the loss of Texas from Mexico. In response, Russia's minister to the U.S., Edward de Stockel, commenced negotiations with pro-expansionist Secretary of State William H. Seward, and while the American public believed Alaska to be a frozen swatch of wasteland, when the U.S. formally took possession of Alaska on October 18, 1867, critics were quick to call it Seward's Folly, or Andrew Johnson's Polar Bear Garden, due to the latter's broad unpopularity amongst American voters. The purchase added 586,412 square miles to the United States, nearly twice the size of Texas, all at a cost of $7.2 million, or less than 2 cents an acre. Public opinion would shift dramatically when gold was discovered in 1899, sparking a gold rush that exposed fortune seekers to temperatures as low as minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The territory achieved statehood on January 3, 1959, which today accounts for more than 25% of American oil extraction and over 50% of all seafood consumed in the United States. While Alaska comprises the largest state by landmass, it sports a hardy population of only 732,000 people, with more than half that number living in the Anchorage metro area alone. Each year, Alaskans celebrate the Alaska Purchase with 2 official state holidays: Seward's Day, observed on the last Monday of March, which marks the signing of the land agreement between the U.S. and Russia, while October 18th celebrates the anniversary of the formal land transfer, making the Alaska Purchase yet another massive acquisition in a nation's full embrace of manifest destiny. As the horrors of World War I approached its final months of bloody conflict, taking the lives of some 40 million people, on January 8, 1918, President Woodrow Wilson outlined his now famous 14 points as a basis for ending the war while promoting world peace for future generations. Woven into his 14 points was a call for democracy instead of authoritarian rule, the later, Wilson believed, contributing greatly to the outbreak of the First World War. He also called for conflict resolution bodies such as the League of Nations and the United Nations, as well as an emphasis on the spread of capitalism and self-determination among nation-states. Wilson also called for collective security by means of a new sense of liberal internationalism instead of isolationism, including freedom of the seas, open borders, and an end to secret treaties between nations. In his own words, Wilson advocated for the General Association of Nations for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small states alike, and in a later speech to Congress, that national aspirations must be respected while allowing people around the world to be governed by their own consent. Wilson's 14 points launched an intense wave of optimism within colonial-ruled nations in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, elevating Wilson to an almost godlike figurehead in colonial-ruled states around the world, prompting Indian nationalist Ganesh Shankar Vijayarthi to hail Wilson as the modern apostle of freedom. Optimism within colonial-ruled nations proved short-lived, however, when the June 28, 1919 signing of the Treaty of Versailles failed to end colonial rule of First World countries over Third World nations, descending citizens of marginalized countries into a communal state of disillusionment and continued despair. Some historians have suggested that not only did the punitive demands the treaty placed on Germany lead directly to the Second World War, but the treaty's complete rejection of Wilsonianism, as Wilson's 14 points are known today, led to a number of protest movements in colonial-ruled nations, including the Egyptian Revolution of 1919, Mahatma Gandhi's passive resistance movement in India, the March 1st movement in Korea, and China's 1919 May 4th movement, making Woodrow Wilson's 14 points a telling missed opportunity for world peace. Buried in debt caused by their participation in World War II. In February of 1947, Britain announced to the United States that it could no longer provide military and economic aid to Turkey and Greece, which led the Truman administration to fear that both nations were under threat by the Soviets for communist expansion and aggression. Leftist forces in Greece had conducted ongoing battles with the Greek royal government since the end of World War II, while the Soviets were pushing for greater control over the Dardanelles, which was a strategic waterway connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. In a speech delivered on March 12, 1947, before a joint session of Congress, President Harry S. Truman pledged to contain the spread of communism in both Turkey and Greece, declaring it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressure. He went on to say that nations could adopt a way of life based upon the will of the majority, which allowed governments to provide guarantees of individual liberty, or face an opposite way of life based upon the will of a minority forcibly imposed upon the majority. Considered by most historians to be the starting point of the Cold War, Congress soon appropriated $400 million in aid to both Turkey and Greece, while establishing U.S. Cold War foreign policy in a proactive attempt to protect nations against communist aggression. While Truman's logic successfully convinced many Americans that the United States was locked in a life-and-death struggle against the spread of communism, not everyone embraced the Truman Doctrine as gospel truth. Upon closer examination, many saw that the insurgency in Greece was supported by the Tito regime in Yugoslavia, who was in the process of breaking from the Soviets shortly after Truman's anti-communist declarations had been made, while the Soviets were not demanding outright control over the Dardanelles, but were merely seeking assurances that they would not be denied access to the waterway, as the Nazis had done in World War II. In the end, despite hefty infusions of cash into the economies of Greece and Turkey, both nations drifted into repressive right-wing regimes in the years following the Truman Doctrine, setting the United States and the Soviet Union on a costly 40-year Cold War path of puppet wars around the world, all the while cloaked under the underlying fear of mutually assured nuclear destruction. While the Cold War between Russia and the United States witnessed 59 significant regional proxy wars, including the 1954 Guatemalan coup d'etat and subsequent genocide that killed an estimated 200,000 people. Among the most impactful and costly standoffs was the Korean War of 1950 to 1953 and the Vietnam War of 1954 to 1975. A byproduct of the Truman Doctrine, The domino theory was a Cold War misperception by Western leaders, suggesting that when one nation embraced communist dogma, then neighboring nations would succumb to the same fate, like dominoes falling in a row. The theory gained increasing importance as war in Southeast Asia escalated from one American presidency to the next, resulting in protracted, costly wars for all sides involved. Nearing the end of the Second World War, Japan's imperial possession of the Korean Peninsula was divided into the Soviet-backed North and the American-backed South, until on June 25, 1950, when some 75,000 North Korean soldiers poured across the 38th parallel that divided the North from the South. In response, President Harry S. Truman and his top military advisors viewed the North's aggression as more than just an ongoing conflict between a long-divided Korea, but rather a war against the spread of communism, which would ultimately lead to wider conflicts with the Soviet Union and China. In the minds of Truman and his advisors, non-intervention was not an option, prompting Truman to explain that if we let Korea down, the Soviets will keep right on going and swallow up one place after another. By the time American fighting men entered the Korean Peninsula, North Korean troops had already reached Seoul, the South Korean capital, marking the Korean War as the first major conflict during the 45-year Cold War between the Soviets and the West. Beginning as a defensive war aimed at pushing the communists out of the South, the Americans found themselves in bed with poorly trained South Korean soldiers who fled battlefields at the slightest provocation, until Truman and Asian Theater Commander General Douglas MacArthur changed the American objective into an offensive war. The strategy shift would see a massive amphibious landing at Incheon, which pushed North Korean forces back across the 38th parallel. But when the Americans pushed farther north to the Yalu River and the Chinese border, Chinese leader Mao Zedong sent troops into North Korea, threatening an all-out war with the United States if the Americans failed to pull back from the Yalu boundary. President Truman had no stomach for an armed conflict with China, resulting in an American pullback from the border, while MacArthur maintained that anything short of a wider war represented a knuckling under to communist threats. In a March 1951 letter to House Republican leader Joseph Martin, McCarthy wrote that there is no substitute for victory against international communism, prompting Truman to fire the storied World War II general on April 11th on grounds of insubordination. Known as the Forgotten War, due to overshadowing caused by World War I, World War II, and later Vietnam, the Korean War was ended on July 27, 1953, re-establishing the boundary between North and South Korea near the 38th parallel, along with the creation of a 2-mile-wide demilitarized zone that still exists to this day. Nearly 5 million people died in the conflict, including some 10% of Korea's pre-war civilian population. Nearly 40,000 American soldiers died in the war, along with more than 100,000 wounded in action, making the Korean War one of the shortest yet costliest wars in American history. After the defeat of the French Union in the First Indochina War of 1946 to 1954, Vietnam gained independence as a divided nation at the 1954 Geneva Conference. The North Vietnamese, led by Russian-backed communist separatist leader Ho Chi Minh, and the U.S.-backed South Vietnamese government, led by Ngo Dinh Diem. Beginning in 1965, after years of CIA-backed guerrilla warfare between North and South Vietnam, the U.S. dramatically increased the number of combat units in South Vietnam, waging full-scale war against the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese soldiers fighting in the South, eventually spilling over into North Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, leading civil rights icon Martin Luther King Jr. to call the American government the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. losing momentum after the rise of the anti-Vietnam War protest movement in the U.S. and abroad. After extensive bombing campaigns spilled into Laos under Operation Barrel Roll, Laos became the most heavily bombed nation in history. The war reached its unceremonious end in 1975, following the fall of Saigon. Not to be outdone by failure, from 1968 until 1989, the U.S. supported campaigns of political repression, state terrorism, and CIA-backed coups d'etats against left-wing and socialist leaders in South America, including Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Ecuador, Paraguay, Peru, and Uruguay. Some scholars have pointed to various crises in America for the nation's involvement in the Gulf War of 1990 to 1991, including an increasing trade deficit, high unemployment rates, rising crime, and growing wealth inequality. During the Arab Spring of 2010 to 2012, U.S. imperialism intervened yet again in Libya after protests erupted against the nation's dictator, Muammar Gaddafi. Initially conducted by a NATO-backed coalition led by France and Great Britain, the U.S. soon took over the primary leadership role as part of Operation Odyssey Dawn. The conflict led to an estimated 25,000 deaths, 50,000 wounded, and 220,000 internally displaced, making American imperialism an ongoing overreach in world geopolitics. And there you have it, American imperialism, today on the Daily Dose. Today's Daily Dose documentary is brought to you by PlatosPeach.com, a lesson planning tool leveraging content like this and much more for educators and homeschooling parents. Check out the description for more information so that you too can teach something new every day.